No, John.
Amen.
I've never interacted with There's one time that
They were looking around. Yeah. Okay, well, I'm glad, Chelsea.
I'm just
Yeah. No, literally, the guys are just sitting here.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm glad.
Yeah.
Good afternoon. I have one announcement before we jump in, and that is for the can I see a hand of the undergraduates? Most of you I've spoke or emailed. Bob Mann, who had been our teaching fellow, he's unable to teach the section for medical reasons. And so what I would like to do is to meet with you just after class today to offer some sections, optional sections, where we can just discuss the material. And so if you could spend like 5 minutes at the end of class, we can figure out a time that works for everyone. And that would be very helpful for me. So I will run the optional sections because I've tried the other graduate students and scholars have their plates are full. So I apologize for that. Today we're going to discuss a comparative study between the United States and Brazil. And what I think is fascinating is that there are very few studies that bring together the United States and Brazil in a comparative study. There's one old book. There's a few newer books, but they're not that great. There's some very rich connections, both in terms of size and in other ways. So in the population of Brazil is roughly 220 million. Population of the United States is 340 million. In terms of size, the continental United States is almost identical in size to Brazil. Brazil also leads the world in having the greatest diversity of fauna and flora on the planet. The United States is not far behind. I don't know if it's second. I think it's second, but I would have to look that up. There's also a rich, fascinating connection in relation to slavery. Brazil was one of the major slave empires along with the United States. Like the United States, in the northeast part of Brazil there was no slavery. Much like in the Free States there was no slavery. Also in Brazil and the United States, the majority of people were poor, but they saw themselves or defined themselves as equal, poor but equal. And the United States, that was also a fundamental understanding of so-called democracy. Another parallel or connection between the United States and Brazil is that both countries are seen as the major countries of what's known as a cowboy Pentecostal combination. Cowboy culture was everywhere in the United States. It was everywhere in Brazil. It was connected, both between the two and the others. There was a profound religiosity to that cowboy culture. One of the, as reflecting what I had said, another similarity is that at the end of the U.S. Civil War, roughly 10,000 Southerners left the United States with their family and their enslaved people and moved to Brazil. Roughly 10,000. This was all in the wealthiest the wealthiest slave societies in Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, the Deep South, which is where the vast majority of the wealth came from. And in fact, Charles Sumner in 1850 highlighted, after analyzing the census, that the wealthiest American constitute 0.3% of the population, and all of them are these immensely wealthy slave owners. And most of these slave owners in the U.S. owned multiple plantations. So if you've read any of Frederick Douglass's autobiographies, Douglass was born on he was born on one plantation. His owner, the owner of the plantation, Edward Lloyd, he owned 5 plantations. So he hired what we would now call today a chief operating officer to run Tuckahoe Plantation. And Brazil was similar. Brazil was the last country to abolish slavery in 1888. And it was done so not through warfare in the way that the United States did. The Brazilian Emperor Dom Pedro II was a rebel ally who had sheltered and supplied southern ships during the war. Dom Pedro II also offered land to these some 10,000 rebels who resettled in Brazil, and Dom Pedro II offered land for these slave owners and their enslaved people for as little as 22 cents per acre, which was subsidized. It helped subsidize their transport. He also helped subsidize their transport to Brazil, and provided a temporary lodging upon arrival. Promised a quick citizenship status, and he actually personally greeted some of the leading rebels when they disembarked. To this day, Brazil, the descendants of Southern slave owners still celebrate in Brazil every year. Another characteristics, as I mentioned, was the degree to which the flora and fauna were similar in Brazil and the United States, which led to a profound growth in terms of goods and various growing using the natural landscape to fulfill one's needs, whereas a lot of countries at the time had to import various goods. So U.S. was a major exporter. Brazil was a major exporter because of the nature of its nation. Roberto is an expert on Brazil. I'm going to turn it over to Roberto to flesh out, and we'll have a discussion.
I'm actually not an expert on Brazil. I'm just a Brazilian. But I will talk about this. I'm going to have a loose and broad discussion, and I do invite your observations and questions. Please do interrupt me. I don't intend this to be a continuous lecture. Brazil and the United States are the two countries in the world that are most like each other. It's astonishing how alike they are in fundamental respects, although neither the Americans nor the Brazilians recognize this similarity, which is even stranger. So there are two countries of almost identical size, the continental United States and Brazil, formed on the same basis of European settlement and African slavery. They are two of the most unequal countries in world history. The United States now of the rich industrial countries and Brazil of the major developing countries. With intense restraints on social mobility, as we had discussed with respect to the United States a couple of weeks ago. They're both among the two most religious societies of the contemporary world. And certainly in the West, one would put them at the very top. In Brazil, we have seen in the last half century a remarkable religious transformation, because Brazil was predominantly Catholic until the middle of the 20th century. And now we have something like 70 million Protestant evangelicals in the country. So it's as if we had a Trojan horse in the country, and inside the Trojan horse are 70 million people who seem as if they came from another country.
U.S. Because evangelicalism in the United States is the most popular dominant form of religion.
It's based on the agro, on agriculture on the West, and therefore associated, as you said, with this cowboy culture. But it is a division in the society which is many-sided and has most recently had striking political consequences. Until recently in our country, we never had a political right of any significance. All the politicians in Brazil pretended to be center-left. And one could joke that the ideal was a tropical Sweden. Not the real Sweden, but an imaginary mythical Sweden in which we kept our fundamental nature, but we reduced inequality by universalizing entitlements to the people. Of course, this was always a myth, because in the real Sweden, there were 7 or 8 decades of struggle over access to political and economic power. And the struggle culminated afterwards by the development of the social democratic welfare state. So the social democratic welfare state was like an epilogue that came after the long narrative of struggle, but the Brazilians have wanted to have the epilogue without having the struggle. And so the idea of this social democratic paradise is an alibi or a substitute for the structural transformation of the country. Then a right wing did arise with many of the characteristics of the contemporary American right. And one of the most striking things about it is that it has no program directly addressed to the tangible material needs of its constituency. So what you might expect in Brazil is a petty bourgeois program. There are millions of small-scale entrepreneurs or would-be entrepreneurs, what I called in an earlier class the subjective petty bourgeoisie, and you would expect that a right-wing movement would have a political economic project addressed to their interests and their identities. But instead of that, the right in power delegated power to the financiers, to the financial interests, and dislocated the focus of national debate to identity politics. So it's like
a mirror of the United States.
Well, and it's like a substitution of real interests, real conflicts, real alternatives for these fantasies. That's what we've had in Brazil, and you must recognize as intimately related to what has happened with the plutocratic populism in the United States. And so we have these very intense class divisions in the country. I just said Brazil is one of the most unequal countries in the history of the world. Connected to the history of slavery, and slavery in Brazil touched every part of the country with the exception of the far south, the extreme south, which was colonized by European farmers, and the interior, the semi-arid interior of the Northeast, which was this region of people who were poor, destitute, without a productive project, but dignified
Yeah, through farming.
through farming and through related activities. Now, what I want to do in this comparative exploration is to consider, first of all, the large sweep of Brazilian economic history, then political history, and finally culture. And consider them not just in relation to the historical transformations, but in relation to the programmatic alternatives that also concern us with respect to the United States. And let's begin with the following theme, the theme of the nation or nationalism. So, in the modern world, nationalism has been primarily a project of the elites in every country in the world. And it is a project that the elites have pursued through war. War has been the anvil on which nationalism has been constructed. But in Brazil, we have no wars to speak of. Our last real war, our last major war, was the terrible war against Paraguay, a genocidal war during which a third of the male population of Paraguay was killed, that Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay waged against Paraguay from 1865 to 1870. So there's no close link then between nationalism and war in Brazil, contrary to what happens in the rest of the world. Now, how then did Brazil become a nation?
Can I ask you,
Yes.
was there any connection between the war in '65 that coincided with the end of the Civil War in '65?
Not that I know of. There was no connection. So there's no belligerent background to this Brazilian nationalism.
Right.
Why did Brazil become a nation at all? Why is national identity so strongly felt in Brazil? It's a mystery. The reasons that are cited are things like the following. First of all, that the Portuguese crown administered the colony in a centralized way rather than in the broken up way, the decentralized way that dominated in Spanish-speaking South America. And second of all, the influence attributed to Brazilian popular culture, which in this rigid class society and these radical divisions among the regions of the country creates a sense of national identity or national unity. I think that these explanations are characteristic of the explanations that historians give for changes in which you have things happen in the world, and then retrospectively we rationalize or think of 10 different reasons why that might have happened, but there's no reason at all to suppose it actually happened because of that. If you ask me why Brazil is a nation and why national identity is affirmed, I think it's that because of mysterious reasons, of unexplained reasons, the Brazilian people have wanted Brazil to be a nation. They have wanted to affirm national identity.
which is in the
Brazil
center.
has been for them a Calvary,
Yeah,
a source of permanent sacrifice, and their response has been to want to embrace it. Part of the mysteries of the human heart. I think this is what real humanity is like.
I mean, it's not that dissimilar from the U.S. as they call it.
Yes, but in the U.S. there was much more an association of the elite, war, and nationalism. So the American elites fought in wars.
Right.
Until recently, they sent their own children to wars, and their children died in wars. And it's only relatively recently that the Americans established the anti-Republican arrangement of having an army of mercenaries in which the poor would fight the wars of the rich. But that was not characteristic of the United States, and that did not explain how the United States became a nation. So, among the reasons why it was hard for Brazil to be a nation, or the formation of a centralized nation is surprising, there are two that stand out. One is the predatory nature of the initial settlements by the Europeans of the country. That is, they looked at Brazil as a place where they would get rich quick and go back to Europe. There was no significant group at the outset that saw Brazil as a place that they would transform in their own image and on which they would place the seal of their own identity. And second, it's a society of such extreme hierarchy and inequality that it's hard to see how the impulse to this identification with the collective could have, despite everything, emerged or prevailed. Now, let's start then with the economic circumstance. And I want to associate my account of Brazilian economic history with three programmatic ideas that I hope to explain in the course of the discussion. The first has to do with nature and mind. So, what we've had in Brazilian history is the divorce of intelligence from nature, rather than what we should have had, which is the marriage of intelligence and nature. And let me explain. So what happens now? Recently, our only productivist project, the only productivist project we had in Brazilian history, which was the mid-20th century industrialization of the country on the basis of import substituting industrialization, has collapsed. Conventional industry, so-called Fordist mass production, is in retreat all over the world, to be sure. But in Brazil, it's retreating radically and rapidly. And Brazil is then turning to its natural resource wealth, especially its agricultural wealth. It's the second leading agricultural producer and exporter in the world. It already is more or less equal to the United States in some areas and has passed the United States in other areas. And its major market has become China rather than the United States. So what happens now in Brazil is that we put on ships relatively untransformed soybean and relatively untransformed iron ore. We send those ships to China, and those same ships bring back to us all the products of the human mind. Everything that requires imagination, intelligence, technology. And this is a ruinous deal for the country, of course, but that's what we have. And the other thing that we have is the control of the economy by the rentiers, especially financial rentiers, although to some extent also natural resource rentiers. So finance and agriculture, or finance, agriculture, and ranching dominate the national economy. Industry, technology, even intellectually dense services have become a pale shadow of what they were in the mid-20th century. There's been a radical economic involution, going backward, in which Brazil has used its natural wealth as a way of not facing its problem, as an escape, and that's what we have. So what we would need to have in each of these regions, we have these radically different regions. I mean, take for example, the Amazon, the size of Western Europe. And people talk loosely about sustainable development of the Amazon. But what does sustainable development mean? It means one of two things. It means either a primitive extractivism, like collecting wood and nuts, or it's a highly advanced version of the knowledge economy. There's nothing in between, the very backward or the very advanced. Either it's heavily based on technology and science to explore the potential economic uses of this biodiversity, or it's just extractivism. Without scale, without science, without technology, and therefore without a future. Now we have the same problem next door in the subtropical savanna. The subtropical savanna, most of which is also technically part of the Amazon, was 50 years ago considered impossible for agriculture because of the characteristics of the soil. And the scientific organization Embrapa, an instrument of the Brazilian state in the period of import substituting industrialization, opened up the subtropical savanna for agriculture and transformed it into one of the agricultural dynamos of the world. So we have this situation in Brazil in which we have 2.5 harvests a year, whereas the temperate countries have 1 harvest. If you plant an eucalyptus forest in the tropical savanna, it grows 2.5 times as fast as the equivalent forest in Finland or Canada. So we have this extraordinary advantage. But the extraordinary advantage, rather than being used to advance the country, becomes an excuse to escape to primitive production, which is enough to keep us afloat. And then the other main driving force in the economy is finance. We have one of the most advanced financial sectors in the world, but it's disassociated from production, from real production. So the governments that we've had in the country, the center-left government of Lula, and now the center-right government, or the right government of Bolsonaro, although appearing to be opposite in many respects, with respect to identity politics and to the cult of the family, are exactly the same, or almost exactly the same, in their attitude to pauperism, that is, the distribution of social benefits, entitlements. That's half of it. The other half is the leadership of finance, the according primacy to the financial interests over all productivist interests. So it's the reign of entitlements and of finance over all the interests of the qualitative elevation and transformation of production. Yes.
When you say that financialization that is divorced from productivity or production,
Yes.
What do you mean by production? Is like the sort of, I don't
Yeah,
know.
so the background is this. Let me make explicit the thesis, even though I can't develop it at this particular moment. So in all the major economies of the contemporary world, the production system is largely self-financed on the basis of the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms. So that then leads to a disquieting question. What then is the point of all of that money in the banks and in the stock market? Theoretically, it is to fund the productive agenda of society. And the most important part of that funding of the productive agenda is the financing of the creation of new assets in new ways. So I'm contrasting the situation that I described to that. So what we have in Brazil is financial hypertrophy without financial deepening. The links between finance and the production system are rarefied, and finance turns to itself and uses the connection to the production system as a pretext rather than as a topic. So what I would say is finance can be a good servant, but it's always a bad master. And if it then takes on this parasitic relation to the real economy, it becomes a disaster. It sucks up not just the lion's part of profit, but the lion's part of talent, as you all see in Harvard College.
So how similar is that to the U.S.?
It's quite similar. It's quite similar, even though the history is different.
Right.
Yes.
Something's not clear, like when Brazilians were actually Portuguese colony and they had a different language, and as the Americans who knew primarily English as the main language, was there no conflict in this period of 1865?
I'm sorry, I'm not hearing you.
So I'm asking is that, was there no conflict in the period of 1865 with the language differences between the Portuguese and the Americans moving down, or was there similarity just because
you're asking
yes.
about this question.
Yeah, so the question is, when Americans moved to Brazil,
The slave owners.
the
yeah.
slave owners moved to Brazil, did they acquire the language? Is that your question?
yes, and wasn't there any conflict at that point?
No, they did. Let me say something about that. They disappeared in Brazil.
Yeah.
They disappeared in Brazil because everyone disappears in Brazil. So I'm now going to add another feature of Brazil which will become relevant as the discussion goes on. A fundamental characteristic of Brazilian culture and Brazilian society that is the opposite of the United States is its syncretism. So Brazil is a society in which everything is combined with everything else. And syncretism, the combination of everything with everything else, is both the problem and the solution. So the most tangible expression of syncretism is miscegenation, racial mixture. So in the United States, the principle was the one drop rule, a crystalline boundary between black and white. In Brazil, it's the opposite. So there's a color continuum in the country, in almost all of the country with the exception of the far south. And everything is mixed with everything else. Now that's not to say that there isn't racial discrimination. There is, and I'm going to say something about that at the end, as one of a series of examples of programmatic problems and options. but it's in that respect a completely different situation. So Brazil is like a big sponge. Everything disappears there. In the state of Sao Paulo, for example, there are more Lebanese, people who were born in Lebanon, or whose parents were born in Lebanon, than there are Lebanese in Lebanon. And that situation is reproduced with respect to a whole set of society. So the Americans think of themselves as a melting pot, they use the slogan, but it's nothing compared to Brazil. What strikes us always is it's not a melting pot compared to the situation that we recognize. So if a Japanese person goes to Brazil, as they went by the millions in the early 20th century, after a couple of decades, they don't want to hear about Japan. So Japan is in some mythical past, and the entire focus now is on this new place. Now, the new place is in some aspects an inferno. It's very attractive in many respects. And we wonder how we could ever become a nation. And yeah, I said, nevertheless it did. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about syncretism in the context of the economic inequality? Because as I've
In
understood
the context of what?
economic inequality, because I've understood like the U.S. will talk about race, but not really about class.
So syncretism is not a direct opposite to class inequality. You would think that class inequality would impose a restraint on syncretism. And thus I asked the question, how could Brazil ever become a nation? One of the things that impeded it from becoming a nation was the rigidity of the class system. But it apparently hasn't impeded it from becoming a nation. So, and I would say that this is associated also with this intangible question of sociability that we discussed in an earlier class. Remember the theme of the middle distance. So, the porcupine, Schopenhauer's porcupine. What are we like? We're like porcupines that come together in the cold night to warm one another. Then we prick ourselves with our spines, we move apart, and we keep going back and forth until we settle into this uncomfortable middle distance. The middle distance is the coldness of the sociability of the modern society, in which liberation, freedom, is associated with coldness. That's a characteristic situation in the North Atlantic society. Now, the Brazilians have never wanted to become cold. And so, mysteriously, they pursued this project of trying to become freer without becoming colder. That's what they've set out to do, against the whole tenor of the countries of the North, right? And I think your question is in a way about that.
Yeah, I guess I'm wrapping my head around like how the favela can exist in such close proximity. And I
Yeah,
think-
so, syncretism has a moral as well as a physical expression. The most direct physical expression is racial mixture, miscegenation. The moral expression is the negation of a tenor of liberal thought and liberal experience, which is that exchange, power, and sentiment should be in separate compartments. Sentiment should go into the family or private life. Exchange goes to the market. Power is for politics and to be disciplined by politics. The moral syncretism to which I refer is that power, exchange, and sentiment should be associated and not separated. And the characteristic form of that in slave societies, like Brazil, was what I would call the sentimentalization of unequal exchange. So the characteristic social relation between a man and a woman, between a boss and a servant, was a combination of exchange, power, and sentiment, which is for the liberal, the nightmare. That's what you don't want. You don't want them to be combined. But that's what the project, the moral project was, as opposed to the economic project. So it is a task for humanity in the next historical period to discover how it can become free without becoming cold. That's what the Brazilians would say in defense of their heresy. So that they're not in the situation that Madame de Staël prophesied when she said societies would emerge that would be prodigal in meetings that rob us of solitude without affording us company. That's the fate of coldness. And that's the missing theme in the history of social theory, because there's a tradition of social theory that deals with domination, subjugation, that's Marxism. And there's a tradition that deals with disunion, and that's Durkheim and the central tradition of sociology. But there isn't a tradition that deals with coldness. So coldness is the third problem alongside disunion and subjugation, with which we have to deal. And every Brazilian, I think, feels that that's a central problem. I think that's one of the ways of defining oneself as a Brazilian, is to think that that third problem is a problem, whereas the liberal wouldn't even recognize it as a problem. They would say, I don't want to even live in a society where everyone is cold. So I want to be in a country like Brazil where the newspapers say, the foreign newspapers like the FT or the Economist, they go to the country for the Olympics or for the soccer championship, and it's a country in which everyone is charming, but at the same time they can stab you to death in the corner. So this is part of these are the enigmas of the real societies of the world. This is much more interesting than abstract. So now we have the situation in which the economic paradigm, we have no productivist project. For most of Brazilian history, we had these cycles, extractivist, predatory cycles, lumber, gold, rubber. We only had one productivist project in our history, and that was this import substituting industrialization. It has now collapsed following the world trend, and it's been replaced by this return to primitive commodity production and export, which is so rich they can keep the country afloat, but it has no future. Compared to the mines, nothing. I keep telling them, this is nothing. You see oil on the bottom of the ocean. Wait for technology to develop it, it'll make that worthless. The only wealth is the wealth of the mine in comparison to that. So that's the situation. Now, in this country in which these regions are radically different, so I was beginning to give the example of the center-west. I gave the example of the Amazon. And I said there, the form of the problem is that sustainable development can only mean the knowledge economy. There's nothing in between the primitive and the vanguard. And the practical issue that we have in the Amazon is land tenure. So less than 4% of the land in private hands has clear legal title. So no one knows who has what. And in that situation, pillage will always be more attractive than either production or preservation. So that's a problem that we have to solve. Now, next door in the subtropical savanna, the dominant economic activity in spatial terms is low-intensity cattle grazing. And the result of low-intensity cattle grazing over time is to transform the land into degraded pasture land. So most of our land now, so the country is the first or second top agricultural producer and exporter in the world. But most of the land actually has already become degraded pasture land. The science of recovery of this degraded pasture land has been mastered. The cost is relatively low, so a fundamental national project would obviously be to recover the degraded pasture land throughout the country, not just in the center west, and to transform it in the physical stage of a new paradigm of agro-pastoral production, with intensification of ranching, more cattle per acre, sustainable forest management, diversification of crops, so we don't depend just on soy, and above all, cumulative industrialization of the agro-pastoral product. And what's that? That's the knowledge economy in the agrarian sector, which we would have to do through a partnership, through an alliance of the state with this rural petty bourgeoisie, as happened in American history in the first half of the 19th century. That this would be the 20th century equivalent to 19th century agricultural extension, which produced the extraordinarily efficient agriculture of the United States in the 19th century. And that, a great project. Now, then one would say, well, so a second project is, you could bring under the label of popular capitalism. So I say that with tongue in cheek because I don't believe in the category of capitalism. I don't think there are these systems like capitalism that are indivisible systems. And then you either have that system or you have another system. I think all that is false. But it's a useful term to use because it's a term that people understand. Especially this petty bourgeoisie, both the actual small business class and what I call the subjective petty bourgeoisie, which wants access. So the state has to organize the access of this massive class of petty entrepreneurs to the resources and instruments of production. Now, not just in agriculture, or in urban, in services, because the main effort is in services. And that then becomes the access. And this petty bourgeois capitalism is in turn the first step toward the ultimate project, which is a knowledge economy for the many, rather than what we have in the world, which is a knowledge economy for the few. And that means developing the knowledge economy in a direction fundamentally different from the direction which the Americans have been developing it. So take the aspect of technology. The hegemonic view in the United States is technology for the knowledge economy should be developed in the form that best lends itself to the internalization of the technology by huge firms, like the platform oligopolies of Silicon Valley. Then second, the midterm objective is automation. It's not the empowerment and equipment of the worker, it's the substitution of the worker. And the long-term objective, stage 3, is the creation of a machine, artificial general intelligence, which is a simulacrum of the human mind, as close as possible to the human mind. In fact, the long-term objective shouldn't be that. the long-term objective should be the creation of a machine that is as different as possible from the human mind, and which therefore has powers, computational powers, which we human beings can't have. And then the partnership of the machine with the anti-machine, which is the human being with imagination, becomes immensely more powerful than either of them alone. That's the project, which would be the alternative project to the American project. And that would take us towards a knowledge economy for the many, rather than the knowledge economy for a few that we have.
And how could that get implemented in Brazil?
Well, then we have all the other things to discuss. So this economic project depends on, first of all, it depends on an educational project. Right? We have to have the human resources. And Brazilian education has been a conspiracy against our natural tendencies. So the aim of the Brazilian education has been to transform young Brazilians of the 21st century into French children of the 19th century. In other words, it's a sort of dogmatic campaign against us.
Wow.
Because everything that's Brazil is anarchy, is creation. And the idea can't be to suppress the anarchy. The idea has to be to decant the anarchy, to equip it, to transform it, and not to replace anarchy by dogma and by the encyclopedia. The aim of education is not for the student to be able to repeat the encyclopedia. So then we need a different paradigm of education, right? Which is analytic and synthetic, which takes as a central theme of education transformation, the way we understand any natural or social phenomenon is to understand how it changes. You can't acquire these capabilities in a vacuum of content, so you need content. But what matters with respect to content is selective depth rather than encyclopedic superficiality. The social setting has to be cooperation between students, among students, between students and teachers, among teachers, among schools, among in-presence and remote, and so forth. And what's most important is that the method of appropriating received knowledge has to be dialectical. That is, every subject, every method, every discipline has to be taught at least twice from opposing points of view. That's how education has to be. And the student has to be delivered to the higher stages of education, to university education, immunized against intellectual servility rather than prepared for it, which is what happens now. So you have to conceive a project which is simultaneously productivist and educational. The educational project is a national project. It won't work if inspired by a little clique of despots in the capital. It has to be embraced by thousands of teachers and by hundreds of schools. And then this combined economic and educational project then needs a political counterpart, right? So the reformers in the world often make the mistake of saying the reform of the state has to come first. It's the mother of all reforms. But things don't happen that way in history. No country reforms its politics and its state in order later to decide what to do with the reformed politics and the reformed state. The reformation of the state happens only in the midst of a struggle to change the economic direction, like the struggle that I just described. And there, I'm going to make just a minimum of remarks, maybe to try and make my position intelligible. So the Latin American republics, all of them, basically imported, they copied the American constitutional arrangements. The American republics organized in the 19th century are, from a constitutional standpoint, copies of the American Constitution with small modifications. So in Brazil, popular culture is enormously vital and original, but elite culture is completely derivative. So there's no constitutional imagination. So a law professor has a library of 20,000 volumes, and his conception of constitution making is to combine aspects of the German, the French, and the American constitution. And that's why we have what we have. And there's something that I think is especially important for Americans to understand, which is that the American Constitution, when it was transported to South America, then became a recipe for caudillismo, personalist leadership by political and military chiefs. The American Constitution was designed for a society in which there was a natural hierarchy, an intellectual and social hierarchy, and the American founders imagined that their Constitution would be implemented by a class of respectable notables who were civically minded, who had spent many years reading up on Plutarch and on Roman history, and that was their formation. They didn't imagine that their Constitution would be implemented in the America of Donald Trump or in the South America of the Caudillos, as it has been. So when this Constitution, with this Madisonian scheme of checks and balances, is transported to a society with much more radical class hierarchies, two phenomena immediately occur. One phenomena is someone is elected president, promising the sky to the masses, promising immediate salvation to the masses. And he arrives in power. And then he discovers that the Constitution was designed to make almost any transformation impossible. Because the Madisonian architecture was designed to inhibit the transformation of society by politics. So the caudillo in power has a choice. Either he resigns himself to the need to co-opt or to be co-opted by the elites, especially the financial elites, or he starts to agitate as a revolutionary despot against the constitutional arrangements. He has to do one or the other. Otherwise, he loses all credibility and is eventually overthrown. And the second thing that then happens is that he finds that his hands are tied by these checks and balances. So he needs a constitutional reformation that cuts the logic of impasse. The American constitutional arrangements in their architecture associate a liberal principle of the fragmentation of power with a conservative principle of the slowing down of politics. He needs a constitution that would reaffirm the liberal principle, but repudiate the conservative one. By, for example, allowing either of the political branches in the presence of an impasse between them to resolve the impasse by calling immediate early elections. There are many ways to do it, that's just one way to do it. But the logic of the constitutional structure in a society that cries out for structural changes has to be completely different. It has to permit and favor the acceleration of politics, not the slowing down of politics. And the acceleration of politics can only happen against the background of a high temperature politics, meaning a politics of intense popular mobilization. For example, one thing I'm going to mention later this time is voting. How can you have a democracy in a country in which less than half of the people vote? That's inconceivable. So everyone has to vote. So you have to have a high temperature politics. You can't buy TV time. Television time is allocated for free to the political parties and the social movements. And the vote is mandatory. And politics is a serious activity, and not just an activity for a little cadre of professional officers.
And so how does Brazil compare to the United States in that sense?
It's similar. It has inherent in the American constitutional.
So voters are in.
There's one exception. One exception. So in one respect, the contemporary Latin American constitutions are very different from the American Constitution. That respect is that they have adapted the tradition of the Constitution of Weimar of multiplying promises of social and economic rights. So the way in which they deal with the coexistence of a democracy with a class structure is to say, we'll promise you all the rights which will make all of that go away. So you'll have free education, free health, free everything, free housing. That's all in the Constitution. And of course, there's absolutely no procedural machinery to enforce that. So it's not serious. The task of the Constitution is not to be this list of fantastical promises, but to show the way out through a political practice with transformative fecundity and potential. That would be doing. But you have to start somewhere. So I think that the way to start is in the struggle over the existing productivist project, the existing strategy of development, so that at a second stage, you can reach the question of the constitutional architecture. And it's not fundamentally different in the United States. It's the same thing. The difference is, of course, the United States is at another level of sophistication. It does have a knowledge economy for the few. It has these platform oligopolies of Silicon Valley, which have discovered a way to make a business model by using and selling the free data of their customers. They've discovered a way of making a business model out of nothing, literally. But with all this exclusive character that results, on the one hand, in economic slowdown, and on the other hand, in the deepening of the chasm between the productive vanguards and the productive rearguards, which is inequality. Now, before we end, I did want to bring up three programmatic issues, but why don't you first question me? Yes.
So earlier, and forgive me if I'm not fully understanding, but I think earlier you said that that we can't expect for government constitutional change to occur without a vision for what the fruits of that change will be.
It's something more particular. I said this, that I think it's unrealistic to expect that change begins in the constitutional domain or in the political domain. I think it begins in a struggle over the economic and social direction of the country. And then you go from that to what you need to do in order to achieve some of the necessary changes. After all, remember that Franklin Roosevelt in the United States had as his allies the biggest economic collapse in economic history and the biggest war in modern history, in all history. And even then he had trouble because the Constitution within which he was operating was designed to give him trouble. And so, but you only reach the constitutional question when you first initiated the struggle over the social and economic direction. Then you reach it. Otherwise, it's an abstraction. It has no immediate reality.
Yeah, and I'm wondering whether I don't think it has to be intention, but I think at least it plausibly could be to say. On the other hand, you said that the Constitution is not like a wish list. The populist will naturally say, "I'm going to give you all these shiny objects, gets into power."
That's not the American Constitution, by the way.
Right.
That's not the Constitution imitated in South America.
I guess I'm just trying to say, like, you could imagine those two things being in tension, right? With someone saying, "Hey, like, coming into office, I'm going to reimagine, economic social orders in order to provide XYZ thing," but
at a minimum, you have to have procedural devices, like, say, the equivalent to the American structural injunctions, how you would implement some of these promises of right. Otherwise, they're just promises. They're unkept promises. They're just slogans. That's not a feature of the American Constitution. That's a feature of all the other constitutions. Because starting with the Constitution of Weimar at the beginning of the 20th century, humanity turned to this effort to sort of just forget or deny the contradiction between class and democracy and pretend that it had solved the problem by putting promises of rights in the Constitution. And that's not serious. So nothing happened to these promises of rights. There they are. You can open the Brazilian Constitution today and you'll see 200 promises of everything. So what? Yes.
Okay, I want to disagree with that a little bit because I feel like universal health care in Brazil, founded through its constitution, if you don't get your medication, you have some sort of legal recourse. Like, that is a promise that when they
It
fail to
actually
keep.
institutes a system of universal health.
Yeah, but that.
So it's simply promising a health right.
Yeah, and I think that's the basis of that's the basis of SUS, right? Like.
Yeah, of course.
But and
But
so
I
of
don't
course you're
think-
hold
but-
accountable.
Yeah, but
to
I don't think
Constitution.
it's not, Constitution shouldn't be filled up with contingent details, right? That's not the idea. So you think in the Constitution, you would put just the principle. And then you would have legislation enacting the principle. When that second part doesn't arise. So it's not really a constitutional issue. It's an issue of forming the institutional arrangements that can solve the problem and backing them up with procedural devices like the structural injunction.
Okay.
Right? I mean, that's the
Yes,
the
but
idea.
the base of the institution comes from the strength of the Constitution. Like, I
Yeah,
think the medication policy is a legislative policy, like a legislated policy,
yes,
that came only because people said, well, if you're going to assume health is a right of all and you're not going to give me medication, which is part of my health,
yes.
and that is, so I think they are mutual, right? Like, I don't think
Yeah.
we disagree with that.
Yes, but the hard part is the actual setting up of the system, which delivers the medical care and therefore keeps the promise.
Yeah. And it's not flawless, but
No.
it's, I mean, better than we can say here, right? Like,
Better than,
Yeah, it's what.
better than you could say here. I mean, it's something. You can't walk into a.
well, I'm not sure it's better than nothing because an unkept promise is a dangerous device politically, right? It devalues the language. The language is meaningless.
Um,
Yes.
Where in history country or in the world currently do you get closest to seeing the kind of dialectical education system that you're discussing, where everything's taught twice? And sort of what have the effects of that been?
I think I see aspects of this educational system in the United States. This was John Dewey's program, or half of it. And as I've argued before here, the Americans only accepted half of John Dewey's program, and his program was only half of what was necessary. So I think in the United States there's a radical educational dualism. There are two different educational systems. Most of the public schools they're just a holding operation. But the United States has some of the best and the worst schools in the world, and the best schools are often characterized by a selective adaptation to Dewey's program.
And many of the instructors or teachers are familiar with Dewey and understand what Dewey is.
And it's not as if I were agreeing 100% with Dewey or consider his educational program ideal, but they moved in the direction of what I was arguing for, especially in the context of these characteristics of the culture that I emphasize. Well, let me then just state my three programmatic suggestions at the end, just to suggest the programmatic uses of comparative history. And I'm going to go from the first, very simple, to the third, relatively more complicated. So the first is extremely simple. It's mandatory voting. Why isn't the vote mandatory? No, I'm asking the question, not a rhetorical question. In 22 countries in the contemporary world, the vote is mandatory. And understand what mandatory voting means. Mandatory voting simply means that you have a legal duty to vote. If you violate your duty, the most that happens is you pay a small fine. So what actually happens in the reality of a system of mandatory voting is that it helps produce a collective habit, and which then has an inertial force of its own and goes on. But what is the possible argument to say you want to have a democracy in which less than half of the people vote? And in principle, above all, most of the poor people don't vote. So that's, how can you expect to resolve the contradiction between class and democracy under those circumstances? So the obvious objection is, the Americans say it's coercive. I don't understand that. You explain that to me, because under the current system in the United States, the obligations to pay declaratory taxes, like the income tax, require you to spend much more time than anything than a few moments going to the corner. Then you have jury duty. Then of course you have military conscription to defend the country if you must. All of these things are incomparably more coercive than the obligation to devote a few moments of your time every few years to the affairs of the Republic. What's the possible justification for saying that people are exempt from the duty to vote? It's crazy, isn't it?
And it's been sustained, I think, by powerful politicians who fear
Of course.
require mandatory voting.
So no one wants to discuss this? So should I go on to the next thing? Yes.
I'll offer an argument friends have made, just effectively my not voting is a statement I'm trying to make against the system, against all options that
Yes.
exist. And then if you're going to force me to vote for either the candidates that exist
No.
or write in, it's just going to create massive
I know,
evidence.
of course. If that held, then there would be an objection. That's not what mandatory voting means. Under every system of mandatory voting that I know, the voter has the prerogative of abstaining from vote to vote. He has to go there, he has to receive his ballot, and he abstains from voting. And under a system of mandatory voting, abstention has a different significance from what it has under a system of optional voting. Because under a system of optional voting, abstention has no meaning. Intrinsic meaning, you can say, well, I think things are fine, so I don't have to go to vote. Under a system of mandatory voting, if the number of mandatory votes that are abstentions is significant, it is a denunciation of the system. And this is what happened in Argentina, for example, when the whole electoral system was delegitimized because of the large number of abstentions under a system of mandatory voting. So I think the effect is not to cancel the prerogative of abstention. On the contrary, it's to render it eloquent in a different way. Now here's a second programmatic suggestion regarding labor law. So you know what the situation of unionization now is in the United States, and in fact in all the North Atlantic economies. Unionization is almost dead. It survives in the United States in the third sector, in philanthropy, and in government employment. But it almost doesn't exist in the private economy. Now, remember what the institutional basis of unionization was. The institutional basis was an idea of reestablishing the reality of contract under the circumstances of radically unequal bargaining power that prevails in the employment relations. So the employment relation, there's radically unequal bargaining power. Therefore, contract risks becoming just a facade behind which the reality is economic duress, which in principle should void the contract. So the idea was to arrange for the workers to organize so that they could rebalance the bargaining power with the employer, reestablishing the reality of contract. That was the legal theory. The legal theory. It was the political and legal theory of countervailing power. Now, it hasn't been enough, obviously, in these circumstances of deindustrialization and collapse of the earlier model of production. The earlier model of production was for this mass production, the large-scale production of standardized goods and services with relatively rigid machinery and production processes, very specialized and very hierarchical relations of production at work. That was the model. That's what's fallen apart. That's the Rust Belt. That's what doesn't exist. It's disappearing in the whole world. Now, is there not an alternative form of unionization before we abandoned unionization altogether? There was. There was an alternative form of unionization in the 20th century. There were two models of unionization. There was one model which was the collective bargaining model, contractualist model. It had two principles. The first principle is unionization is purely voluntary, that workers choose or not to unionize. The second principle is unionization is completely independent from the state, from the government. It's a matter of the private economy and of the choice of the worker. There was another model, and it was the fascist model of fascist Italy, Mussolini's model of the Carta della Lavoro of 1937. And under that model, all workers were automatically unionized, according to the combination of functional and territorial principles. Where they work in the production system, their sector, and where they were locating their place, their territory. And so the first principle was everyone is unionized according to function and according to place. And the second principle was the union structure is an instrumentality of the state. It controls the union structure, typically through a Ministry of Labor. Now what happened, and this relates to our story about Brazil, is that the nationalist, populist, leftist regimes in Latin America in the middle of the 20th century, Cárdenas in Mexico, Vargas in Brazil, and Perón in Argentina, adopted this corporatist model. And they used it as what the political scientists would call controlled popular mobilization. There was a Ministry of Labor that negotiated with the unions, the union bosses, in the political interests of the populist leader, the caudillo. Now, this is then the choice that persisted in the 20th century. In the late 20th century, this corporatist structure persists in a fossilized form, and the contractualist system is disappearing. Although many people try to propose it as a 21st century solution to a 20th century problem. There's an obvious alternative. The obvious alternative is a hybrid regime. The hybrid regime takes from the corporatist principle, the corporatist model, the principle that everyone is unionized automatically. And it takes from the contractualist model the principle that the unions are completely independent from the state. With the result that then different labor movements, affiliated or not to political parties, then contest for position in the unitary structure of the unions, just as political parties in a democracy contest for position in the unitary structure of the state. That would be the solution. Now, what do I think? I think that this would be an ingenious solution, but it may be too late. So, the ship may already have sailed. The decline of the union structure may now be so severe that it's irrecoverable. Because, notice the features of institutional redesign transformation. The institutional repertoire at any given point available in the world is relatively inelastic. We don't choose among all options. This isn't a laboratory in which we're theoreticians comparing alternatives. We choose among things that are known to the politicians, to the leaders. There are established live options. And this is one. And then we discover through institutional design that in institutional design, small changes can have vast effects. Changes of the constitutional arrangement, like the arrangement that I discussed before. So I don't know whether this is a real option now or not. Probably not. Probably it's too late. But that just shows you that it's not all one big system in which everything is predictable. Because if this had been seen early enough, understood early enough, and widely enough, it would have changed the political calculus in the relations between capital and labor.
If there's an effort to unionize at a local or state level that is successful, could it then start to expand and overturn the trajectory that's occurred over the past?
But on the other hand, the economic forces that are leading to deindustrialization are so powerful that they may then overwhelm this calculation. I don't know. But it's just to say that the institutional narrative is not like something that's totally transparent and known. It's not like a mechanism that's playing itself out in a relentless way. Now, I'm saying that each of these suggestions is in an ascending order of complication. Now let me give the most complicated of the three. The most
Can
complicated.
I ask a quick question about number 2,
Yes,
just before you get away from number 2?
yes.
So when you were talking about unions becoming completely independent of the state, could you just repeat what you were saying about how political parties would interact with unions differently?
There's one structure of a democratic government. The political parties contest for position in that structure. How is that different from different movements, labor movements, linked or not to political parties, contesting for position in the structure of government? They're completely independent of the government. They're trying to assume the control, the governance of part of the union structure, but they're independent. Now let me say further, because I didn't say, that each of these models that I described, the corporatist model and the contractualist model, has a distinctive dynamic that should be understood. So the contractualist model has 3 main consequences. The first consequence is that it focuses the effort of the union militancy on unionizing and preserving unionization. And it's like a labor of Sisyphus. It's always rolling down the hill and they're always having to roll it back. So that's the first consequence. The second consequence is that under a contractualist labor law model, the inequalities in the labor force are echoed and reinforced in the union structure. So, because the contractualist regime has an anti-solidaristic tilt to it. In a real economy, in one of the real so-called capitalist economies, there's a great distinction between work in the capital poor sectors of the production system and work in the capital rich sectors in the economy of the production system. The more capital rich, the more capital intensive the sector is, the more is there a tendency for the workers to be in effect partners of the capitalists. They have common interests against everyone else. That's what happens in a contractual system. The contractual system favors the segmentation of the labor force. If your emphasis is on the preservation of solidarity and universality, you don't want that. You want to tilt in the opposite direction. And the third characteristic, the third consequence of a contractual system is that it favors the predominance of economistic claims, goals, over non-economistic claims. That is, the corporatist system is much more hospitable to objectives that go beyond wages and benefits. Whereas the contractual system favors an exclusive focus on wages and benefits. So, in other words, it favors the depoliticization of the labor force. So that's another reason to seek an alternative to the contractual system. But in the whole literature of labor law and labor relations, I haven't seen a single reference to this, to these alternative models. It's as if collective bargaining were naturally the only model. Why do they think that? I have no idea. But this is how they think. So it becomes assumed as natural, then as necessary, inescapable, and so forth. Okay, so this my last experiment, the most complicated, has to do with the relation between race and class in the United States and in Brazil. and that obviously is an incendiary issue. So, there were many approaches to the relation between race and class in American history. Let's remember them quickly. So there was the accommodationist approach of Booker T. Washington. Seek a deal with the established order, and in that order, seek the position of the petty bourgeois entrepreneur. That's what Booker T. wanted. Then the second view was the apparently radical solution of escape. Rebel, escape, go back to Africa. Now, I argued before that in practice, that view, which seems to be on the surface the opposite of the first view, in practice was often just like the first view, because the actual practice of it turned out to mimic the first thing. So Louis Farrakhan may pretend to rebel, but if you go and see him, in practice he's acting just like the leader of a respectable little petty bourgeois community. And he's all dressed up, and he's all constructed and manifest in the same way, presenting the same message of accommodation and respectability.
But there's also the long-standing vision of Douglass and Du Bois.
Yes, of course. Of course. So then a third program would be the program of combining race and class. Now that was just a moment in American history, especially the moment of the brief years of Reconstruction. 40 acres and a mule and so forth. Combining the struggle against racial injustice and struggle against class injustice. And now we come to the fourth approach, which is the hegemonic approach now, which is the orthodoxy, the integrationist orthodoxy, which I think would most accurately be called the threshold approach. So the threshold approach is you separate race from class and you treat it as an antecedent issue. And you say, we have to deal with race first, and later we'll deal with class. That's what I'm calling the orthodox approach, the integrationist orthodox. Race first, and separate from class. Now, relating directly to the discussion of Brazil, the AFL, not the AFL, I'm mixing it up with the other example. They have now imported into Brazil this American Orthodox in a completely different society. So we have a racial continuum. We have a mixture of everything. We don't have this black and white clear boundary. Now they come and say we should have the same thing. So racial discrimination is the focus, and racial discrimination combines prejudice and structure.
In what way?
Structure. Well, it doesn't deal adequately with structure, but it pretends to be dealing with a structural injustice. They've introduced this into Brazil. The left has introduced it, and the right has more or less agreed sometimes to it. And it's produced huge confusion, because first of all, this is a class in which everyone is more or less mixed. So what happens? You have to, people apply to go to school, to fancy universities. They have to declare what they are. What noun will they use to describe the racial mixture? Since everyone is more or less mixed. Except if you're very rich, they'll say you're white. It results in this pandemonium. Now, when they imported this American system, relatively recently, Brazil was beginning to develop an alternative. And here's the alternative. The alternative said, individualized racial discrimination, we are going to treat as a crime. It's going to be criminalized. And there are many ways of proving it, of course. And there are many countries in which racial discrimination today is a crime. But structural disadvantage should be dealt with by structural means. Structural disadvantage is an entirely different problem. We have to define it structurally, and we have to respond to it structurally. So, and in structural disadvantage in a class society, what's likely to happen is that the predominant disadvantage is always class. The other disadvantages are accessories or aggravations of the class structure. So, for example, if you take a simple class criterion to deal with racial oppression in the prison population, you're automatically going to get a lot of people who are mixed blood, who are mixed colored, because race will be the primary causal factor. So then instead of a threshold approach, that's the distinction you have. You say, we're going to separate discrimination from structural disadvantage and exclusion. And we're going to deal with them by different instruments. That was the approach that we were beginning to develop. And it was cut. It was stopped in its tracks by surrender to the American method, which has produced now this emerging disaster. So let me remind you of the arguments against the racial orthodoxy, the threshold approach, as I'm calling it. There are three main arguments. The first argument is it generates benefits that are in inverse proportion to the need for them. So what it benefits most is the black professional and business class, the black elite, which it has admittedly helped to establish. Next, it benefits less, but it does benefit the black working class, especially in government employment, policemen and firemen. And who does it benefit least? It benefits least the masses of poor blacks, the black underclass, who are in the secondary part of the labor market and who fill the American prisons. Those it doesn't benefit at all. And not only doesn't benefit them, but it separates them from those who would be their natural leaders, because their natural leaders have now been accommodated by this Vichy system of conquering the leadership of the opponents. So that's the first objection. The second objection then is the division of the blacks in between their natural leadership and their rank and file. And the third division, which has momentous consequences for American politics, is the offense to the white working class majority of the country, which, with greater or lesser justification, believes itself to be the victim of a conspiracy between the whites and their own leaders against them. So then you say, we won't have that. We'll have this other system. And then this other system, which would be more justified by the Brazilian circumstances of syncretism and racial mixture, might also be useful in some respects in the United States. So in other words, even a very complicated problem generating immense tension in the United States, like this one, lends itself to illumination through comparative analysis. Brazil would say, we're not going to follow the American path, And then the Americans might say, and so we're not going to follow, we too might not follow the American path. Let's get off it.
What's the potential of that happening?
The potential is very low. Nothing but to have a mind stacked with insight
Yes.
into the reality of the situation and the nature of possibilities. Changes itself is a change. Rather than to have people burdened by myths and illusions about what's thinkable and what's not. From a purely legal standpoint, there's no doubt that this is possible. And I think a great advantage is to begin to develop the arsenal of policies and institutional ideas that deal with the fundamental structural contradiction between democracy and class. That's the basic issue in this. So the idea of the orthodox, or the racial orthodoxy in the United States is, yes, that race, democracy and class is a fundamental issue, but it's so complicated, it has so many sides. Let's first deal with this already egregious problem before we deal with that one. And I think that's an illusion, because you can't separate out the problem that way. And it results in these distortions that the Americans, and this has had fundamental consequences for the course of American politics.
And how does Brazil function today, in which you say that there's not a sense of the one-drop rule that there has long been in the United States?
Well, there's never been a sense in the one dollar. Brazil has never been
Right, it's never been.
hospitable to this clear boundary
Right.
between white and black.
Right.
And as I say, that doesn't mean that there's not racial discrimination.
Right.
There is racial discrimination, but it has a completely different form, a different expression. And what's absurd is then to approach it as if it were like in the United States. Because that can't be right. So the Brazilians, it's only the extreme dogmatism or pig-headedness that prevents the Brazilians from seeing that their situation is different.
And what are they doing now?
They're following, this is what's happening now. So going back to the earlier part of my discourse, Brazil is getting poorer fundamentally, superficially rich, and in reality poor. It's becoming more primitive economically, less complicated. It's moving away from the goals of the three goals of a marriage of nature and a mind, a popular capitalism, and a knowledge economy for the many. It's moving further away from them. And this business here of diverting the discussion to this business of race and class and adapting the mythical lenses of the Americans to our very different reality is making it even worse.
Right. So Brazil is essentially borrowing
Borrowing these false glasses, these false lenses to interpret our reality. And as a result, to misrepresent our possibilities. That's what's most important. So I think this subject of comparison has fantastic potential to demythologize, to illuminate, to inspire the imagination of alternatives, which is one of the most fundamental things in politics.
why coupling Brazil and the US could lead to some very rich alternatives. In terms of their similarities.
So one of the things that strikes me most is the second and the third experiments I mentioned. That I think the Americans didn't understand how hospitable their revered Constitution is to the South American Caribbean, because the Latin Americans discovered it. But now the Americans have reason to discover it in their own country. But the cult of the Constitution is so intimately related to the American sense of identity that it's hard for the Americans to admit that. I don't have any other thesis to formulate, so I'm happy I rest my case.
Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, can I just ask a follow-up on the cult of the Constitution point and why it's hard for Americans to admit that perhaps their Constitution works for other countries? Is it important
No,
because
it's hard for them to admit that it works for other countries. It's hard for them to admit that it doesn't work for them.
oh
That's what I was saying.
oh okay.
That it is favorable to something which they think is of the antithesis of their arrangements. So they think that if you throw lots of sand in the wheels and you surround everything with contradictions, oppositions, impediments, you make it safer for everyone. That's not what happens in politics. If you make everything stop, you increase the pressure for agitation, for overwhelming, and for personalization in politics, because personality is the shortcut. You don't have an institutional idea, you have a person. And one of the things one learns by any kind of engagement is that it's much easier to change a country than it is to change a person. So if you end up with a person, you're in real trouble. It's the country. To change a country, you only need to be a statesman. To change a person, you need to be Jesus Christ. It's a different level of ambition.
That is a different level.
I think that's it.
Thank you.
I guess that's over. Thank you so much. I'm so glad that you did that.
Yeah, you got me.
I know. I know. Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh. Yeah. Yeah, very different environment. So exciting.
Yeah, so I did, that's gonna be
Like, oh, that's what much feel.
like to say I'm excited knowing that
Oh, I'm so excited.
not cold weather.
Oh, it's gonna also, snow again. I love.
My mom,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, she and I need because right now it's like hanging.
You serious?
Yeah, or yesterday it was like 7.
God. Yeah, that's wild. Oh.
I know, yeah. Yeah, it's, you heard the term, or the phrase, don't yuck my yum.
Yeah,
She
yeah.
and I do that to each other all the time. The weather.
Well, I hope, sorry.
Sorry, this is like.
Hope maybe you can find some joy in it.
Yeah, I mean, this is on,
You're like,
this truly, no, this is truly like the most joyful I felt. I don't know. That one's prettier to me.
oh, really?
Yeah, just 'cause like,
Building?